Good morning, everybody. My name is Temuulen Sankey. I also go by Teki. I'm a remote sensing professor at Northern Arizona University. And I was asked to come here today and talk about UAVs and LiDAR and 3D point cloud data. And so that's what I'm going to be focusing on in my presentation today. And I'll go through a bunch of application examples that we're working on at NAU. Okay, so before I get started, I just wanted to. Is it possible to have both screens looking the same? No,
I have no idea.
it's okay. We'll just move forward like this.
Well, the one that's being shared is this one.
Okay.
So the presenter view is only for those in the room.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. Okay, so before I get started, I just wanted to acknowledge all of my co-authors. I run a big research lab at NAU, and so all of my graduate students are the actual people who generated a lot of the data sets and examples I'm going to be sharing with you today. And so without them, we wouldn't have all the full application examples. Also, before I get started talking about UAVs, I just wanted to take a second and acknowledge that about half of what I do and half of what NAU Remote Sensing Lab does is focused on satellite images. Many of you probably do use satellite data, but I wanted to just start off by saying there is all different types of satellite images freely available to the public at daily, weekly, bi-weekly time intervals. And we use that a lot for all different kinds of applications, remote sensing applications at a continental scale or at a regional scale across Arizona or across the Western US, things like that. But of course, today I'm not going to be talking about that. I'm mostly going to be talking about UAVs. So first of all, if there's all this amazing satellite data available, why do we need UAV images? Why would we use that? So just to illustrate that with a simple example, I'm here showing a zoomed in example of a Landsat satellite image, which has been up in space for over 40 years now. And so here I show a winter Landsat image with a bunch of snow that appears white, of course. And then all the red pixels are pixels with green photosynthetically active vegetation, most likely forest. And so if you were to zoom into those pixels over here, you can see the individual 30-meter pixels in which you really can't tell what's what. But in comparison, here I show the same area in a UAV multispectral image, false color composite. And so what you see in red is healthy green vegetation. And of course, you see some snow cover. And so this is exactly why I'm interested in using UAV images in my research, because I'm interested in mapping and delineating out all the different land cover types that you see here. So individual trees, bare ground cover, snow cover, and you name it. So in my lab, we're using these kind of high resolution UAV images for all different types of environmental applications along with satellite data. Typically in our research, we use a combination of the two. So we have really high resolution images at a local scale, which then we combine with regional scale satellite data. Another reason, or a couple more reasons why we use UAV images is that, of course, as you know, from the UAV images, from the UAV platforms, you can get images that have anywhere between 6 to 20 centimeter pixels, 20 centimeter spatial resolution. Of course, you can fly your UAV platforms at a user-defined interval, so on a daily interval or several times in a day if you were monitoring how plants are responding to different kinds of weather or climate variables on a daily or on an hourly. Also, what's really important for me in my lab group is that once you have a UAV platform, you can equip that with whatever sensor you want. And so that user-defined sensor capability is really important for us because we like to operate spectral sensors, LiDAR, and thermal sensors. That is a really important factor for us. Okay, so at NAU, we operate two different types of UAV platforms. One is a large octocopter UAV, and another one is a fixed-wing UAV from SenseFly. So this is it. I'm going to be talking about examples from both of these different types of platforms. First, I'm just going to talk about the octocopter UAV. So this platform was custom engineered for my lab because I wanted to deploy on this platform a hyperspectral sensor that has about 200 or so spectral bands. So in comparison, our phones, when we take an image, for example, it gives us 3 spectral. But this sensor gives us about 200 or so spectral bands. I have a GNS INS on this, and then I also have a Velodyne LiDAR sensor that I operate on this. And together they weigh almost about 8 pounds or so, which is the maximum payload for this platform. Because it's carrying such big payload, this platform currently operates only for a short amount of time, for about 8 or 9 minutes at a time, which gives you about an acre per phone. So here, I am flying the octocopter UAV at a Cottonwood genetic experimental garden that NAU has. And so we typically manually launch this platform, and then I'm getting it to a pre-programmed flight altitude. Once I get it at that altitude, then I tell it to go and image a pre-programmed plot. Okay, so I mentioned I have a hyperspectral sensor on this. Why would I want a big, heavy, expensive hyperspectral sensor on this platform? It's mostly because we know that all different Earth surfaces or land cover types give us a unique spectral signature if you have many, many different spectral bands like I have on this platform across this spectral range. So for example, a spectral signature of clean water looks like this, whereas a spectral signature of a healthy green vegetation looks like that. And so because of those different spectral signatures, we can separate out different plant cover types in really, really high resolution. So here's an example of a hyperspectral image displayed both in true color and false color composite here in these two panels, but I'm showing bare ground spectral signature here, and then in the top panel I'm showing hundreds of pine spectrum. And so these differences are what I'm leveraging, classifying and detecting different vegetation species across my study areas. The second sensor on this platform, of course, is the Velodyne LiDAR scanner that gives us about 32 points per square meter if I'm flying at about 6 miles per hour. So the LiDAR is constantly operating, and so if I am flying slowly over a plot, of course, I get much higher density in cloud. Whereas if I'm flying fast, at fewer points. Just in comparison, most manned airborne LiDAR data have anywhere between 5 to 15, 20 or so points per square meter. And so this data set because of the GNAS, we are getting about 6 centimeter accuracy. This is just an example of a LiDAR data set that we get from this platform. And so here I'm showing a colored LiDAR point cloud data. The points are colored by height, so elevation. Bright red spots are the tallest points, so the top of the trees. And then the green and the blue points are the lowest points, so bare ground or herbaceous undergrowth. So here I was imaging a study area, ponderosa pine forest that was thinned over here and then non-thinned over here on the other side. One thing I wanted to note here was that this LiDAR scanner on this platform gives me a single return. That means is that we hit the exterior of the Earth's surface or trees in this example. What that means is that we don't see what's below canopy. So if you have multiple return LiDAR data, you would penetrate through the vegetation and see, you know, the lower canopies or below the. But in my data, below the canopies, sometimes. Okay, so this is some examples of the LiDAR point cloud data in different environments. So in the top panel, I show that the same image that we just looked at in a forested environment. In the middle panel, I showed the LiDAR octocopter data in a forest grassland ecotone environment. And then in the bottom panel, I show point cloud data in a grassland environment. In this slide, I'm just showing you a comparison between different sensors. And so, of course, in the top panel, we're looking at the same octocopter UAV LiDAR point cloud data that we were just looking at. In the middle panel, I am showing a structure from motion point cloud data that was photogrammetrically generated, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then in comparison here in the bottom panel, I show a terrestrial LiDAR point cloud data. So, of course, here in this example, the terrestrial LiDAR scanner was sitting about here. And so these trees closer to the scanner got a lot more points compared to the trees that are farther out. Okay, so before we apply any of these data sets for any of our research questions or science applications, the very first thing that we do, and in fact, I spend half of my time doing this, is assessing the accuracies of these data sets and quantifying the accuracies before we apply any of this. So from the octocopter UAV LiDAR, we're mostly interested in measuring individual tree dimensions. So in particular, we're talking about tree height and canopy diameter, and base height and canopy height, basal area, all different kinds of things. And so we compare the UAV LiDAR data to either very, very high resolution ground-based LiDAR data, or we compare them to field-based measurements, like actual manual measurements, to assess how well the LiDAR-derived estimate. Once we determine the accuracies, then we can apply that data set over a broader area to estimate a whole bunch of different variables. So here I am showing a linear regression model where I am correlating the LiDAR-derived octocopter UAV LiDAR-derived individual tree height paired to field measured tree height, where we're getting very high R squared of 0.9, and so our estimates are very, very accurate. We're also getting similarly high correlation between tree canopy diameter estimates from this LiDAR data. And so once we assess that correlation, as well as the average error associated with that estimate, then we can apply the same data set over like an entire forest stand or an entire treated forest area. Similarly, from the octocopter LiDAR, we also derived a bunch of other variables, one of the most important ones being digital elevation models, or DEMs, where we're measuring bare ground height. When we assess the bare ground height estimated from the octocopter LiDAR, we also see a very strong correlation compared to terrestrial LiDAR derived DEM. So with that confidence, we can then go on to estimate or generate very, very high resolution DEMs. So here in this example, I show a digital elevation model that we generated from the octocopter LiDAR data in 10 centimeter spatial resolution. Most of you probably know that the publicly available digital elevation models for us in the US is about, it has a 10 meter. So here I'm showing a sand dune in this digital elevation model that is depicted here in true color composite in this polygon. This sand dune, we were creating high resolution DEMs for all these sand dunes on the Trier Plateau right above East Ferry as a main sediment source for the Colorado River as these sand dunes flow downwind into the Colorado River as a major sediment source. So we were estimating the sizes in the area and the volume of the individual sand dunes, which we then convert into total weight of all the sediment that we can expect the Colorado River to receive from trees. Similarly, we need very, very accurate, high resolution digital elevation models if you are interested in snow measurements and figuring out how land management and forest management treatments are impacting snow distribution on the ground. So here, student and I are flying the octocopter UAV to measure ground surface when we have a bunch of snow. And then if you were to image the same area again when there's no snow, then of course you can difference the two digital elevation models to figure out how much snow you were getting, to estimate snow depth and how it varies across. Okay, in a very different example, here I show a rangeland monitoring example from the UAV octocopter data as well as the hyperspectral data. So up here in panel A, I show a rangeland monitoring plot with a whole bunch of different instrumentation. And in the center of the plot, in the middle panel, panel B, I am showing an example of a terrestrial LiDAR data of that, the same plot and of that, the same creosote bush overlaid with the true color image from the top panel. And then in panel C, I show the octocopter LiDAR data in a rangeland environment. And so here you can really see the individual laser points of some of the instruments as well as that one shrub canopy. And so what this kind of data still allows us is that to measure and classify individual rangeland vegetation species as well as different soil types. We're able to do this by combining the LiDAR data to a hyperspectral image that we're getting from the same octocopter. So here I show several different vegetation plots that we imaged with the octocopter UAV. And these are zoomed in sections of the same image, and using the hyperspectral data and the unique spectral signature in this data, we're then able to estimate, separate out all the different shrub species or all the different herbaceous species, as well as the different soil types that are all associated with different amounts of soil organic matter and nutrients. And so in this application, we were mapping range-line vegetation species as well as soil nutrients in a burned and unburned rangeline. So here I show the same hyperspectral image up at the top panel, and in the middle panel is the species level classification just using the hyperspectral data alone. And then in the bottom panel, I show the classification that was based on fusion of the hyperspectral data as well as the LiDAR data. And as you can see, here in the bottom panel, we're getting much more detailed classification when we combine the two data sources rather than just using a single source. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to the fixed wing UAV and talk about that. So as I mentioned before, we operate a SenseFly EBX fixed wing UAV from Switzerland. This UAV operates a single sensor at a time. So you can only deploy one sensor at a time, unlike the octocopter UAV. Because it's operating just a single small sensor, it flies for a much longer time period, which means then we can image a much larger area at a time. So here, we're just deploying the fixed wing UAV. This platform is manually launched. And then once it gains the elevation that we want it to, then it goes and images the pre-programmed area. At the end of the flight, it comes back and crash lands. So it's a platform that's made to crash. Okay, this is just an example of how the SenseFly EB operates. And so we're launching it from here. It's gaining elevation, and then it goes and images our study area in a pre-programmed pattern. So in this example, we're doing a highly overlapping perpendicular flight lines because we're interested in using this data to photogrammetrically generate LiDAR-like. So that requires very, very high image overlap. So from the fixed wing UAV, what are the kinds of data sets you get? So in the top panel, I show a multispectral image. This has about 15 centimeter resolution, where in red, you can see individual tree canopies. Next to each one of those trees, you see shadows associated with them. Using this, then we can classify tree canopy cover, which I show in panel B. So the gray pixels are the footprint of those individual tree canopies. And then, as I said before, using the multispectral image with the photogrammetric algorithm known as the structure for motion, or SfM, we generate LiDAR-like point cloud data that looks like this in panel C. So this is not a true LiDAR data, but it looks and can be used just like a true LiDAR data. Therefore, I call it a LiDAR-like data. Why do we want that? Because this platform can image a much bigger area. We're interested in using this platform to generate these kinds of data sets from which we can then calculate tree density per acre or individual tree height, canopy dimension, all the other previous examples. And so here is another example of the structure from motion LiDAR data. And this is just in the raw format where we're just coloring the individual points by height. But then here, I'm showing an example of individual trees that are delineated from that LiDAR. One thing that's important about the structure from motion data or SfM data is that you can generate that kind of a data set at a user-defined point density. So it becomes a much higher resolution data than a true LiDAR. Okay, so I'm just now going to go through several examples of the fixed wing UAV data and how we're using it. So here in this example, I flew the UAV, fixed wing UAV in central Arizona at the Sierra Ancha Experimental Forest that's been monitored by the Forest Service for about a century now. In particular, here I am imaging 4 adjacent watersheds that the U.S. Forest Service chemically treated in 1954 to control woody vegetation expansion or woody encroachment. So this is a chaparral vegetation type in central Arizona with pinions, junipers, vanilla oak, manzanita, things like that. And so they were chemically treating 2 of the watersheds. And when I went there, imaged the study area in 2019, this is the multispectral image I got. And watersheds A and C were chemically treated roughly about 60 years ago now, or 60 some years ago. And you still see the impact of that chemical treatment now in terms of both the total woody cover, which we can estimate just from the multispectral data here. So once again, this is a false color composite, and so the bright red areas are the individual trees or woody vegetation canopies. So we find significantly lower woody cover at the 2 treated watersheds compared to the untreated watersheds. But once I've delineated these individual woody species, I also then estimate the canopy dimension and the height of this woody vegetation at the individual canopy level using the structure from motion data. Then I use that with a I have students out in the field today who are waiting for me. They're probably wondering, why are you late? Once I have the structure from motion data and I have canopy dimension and height estimated, I can then use allometric equations to estimate the total above ground biomass of individual trees. Then at the watershed scale, I can summarize all of the biomass per species. Then I can convert that to net above ground carbon accumulation. And here, what we see is that 60 some years later, the treated watersheds have significantly lower woody biomass per species, and therefore also significantly lower total carbon. So it's just important for us to remember when we do these landscape scale treatments, they have very, very long lasting impact, both in terms of total biomass, vegetation cover, and carbon accumulation. But also then I compare this data set to long-term water and sediment yield data. From that, what I find is that the treated watersheds have significantly higher water yield because they have fewer woody species that are transpiring a whole bunch of water. And so we get significantly higher water yield. In contrast, though, we also get significantly lower sediment yield in the treated areas because these woody species tend to get big over time and have a whole bunch of exposed bare surface or bare ground underneath them, which are very prone to soil erosion and sediment. So many, many decades later, you still see very important significant impact. Now I'm going to just go through a bunch of examples from northern Arizona, where we are studying hundreds of pine forests, mostly right outside Flagstaff. This was at a study area called Chimney Springs, which was thinned by the Nature Conservancy as part of Arizona's Forest Restoration Initiative, FORFRI. And we imaged this study area with the fixed wing multispectral sensor before the thinning treatment. And then after the thinning, we assessed whether the specific thinning prescription goals were met or not. And so, of course, from this, one of the key things we're estimating is how did forest canopy cover change. Then, using the multispectral image with structure from motion, we're also generating 3D point cloud data. Then, using the 3D point cloud data, we can estimate in tree density per acre, and we can literally count how many trees were taken out. And so we estimate that post-thinning, we have about 30 trees per acre. Another important thing we're estimating is how the post-thinning forest structure is influencing snow on the ground. Of course, when we have very, very high density and high canopy cover in a forested environment, a lot of the canopy intercepts snow, and so you get less snow accumulation on the ground. But post-thinning, in between the forest patches, in the interspace area, we get much higher amount of snow, but also these patches create shade for the snow that's accumulated on the ground, and depending on what size and shape and orientation of forest patches you create through these thinning or burning treatments, they, of course, create very different types of impacts on snow accumulation on the ground, A. B, how that snow melts into the spring season. So some of the snow patches linger on for a long time into the spring season because they're receiving more shade, and they slowly fade into water. And so we have been estimating to identify an optimum patch size, density, distribution, and geometry that maximizes snow accumulation on the ground and reduces the melt time. What we're finding is that optimum forest structure is about 24 to 33% canopy cover, and the patches need to be about 1.5 times bigger than the mean. So that's this. The second part of the information is what we're getting from the structure from motion. Also, at the same study area, we have a huge network of soil moisture sensors, 130 or so soil moisture sensors, and we have been monitoring how the thinning impacts soil moisture across like a forest density gradient. What we find is that, so we've been measuring soil moisture at the site since 2018. What we find is that soils are dry at locations where we have very high tree density, very high canopy cover, and very high basal area. And interestingly, where we have very short trees. That's because shorter trees, of course, create lesser or smaller shadow. So the soils get dry. So in terms of what kind of a forest structure would be optimum for maximizing or optimizing our soil moisture, we find that at about 30% canopy cover, with less than 100 trees per hectare, with less than 25 meters squared per hectare basal area, is where you are getting the optimal soil moisture. And we're basing this on are detailed soil moisture measurements that you see over there between the thin and the non-thin forest stands. We're also getting exactly the same conclusion from the hectare. Okay, so here I'm just showing a map of that, the same area with the thinning boundary going across here. And we have been monitoring this thinned and the non-thinned adjacent forest stand throughout this currently ongoing North American mega drought that we've been hearing all about in the news. So we have been imaging this study area with a thermal sensor on the fixed wing UAV, because the thermal sensor gives us surface temperature measurements, so we can estimate individual tree canopy temperature. Why do we care about that? So here is the National Drought Monitoring Map from July 2021, so last summer. Of course, huge majority of Arizona was at that time experiencing extreme drought or exceptional level of drought, which is the most severe level of drought in their classification. And so we were interested in seeing how this treated area and the non-treated area was responding to that drought. What we find is that using the canopy, using the thermal image, we can overlay the temperature image on top of our canopy height model that we get from the structure from motion data, and delineate only the pixels that correspond to a tree canopy and exclude all of the temperature pixels from the interspace areas and just estimate the canopy temperature. What we find is that under normal precipitation years, like 2018, for example, here, the thinned forests generally have, thinned trees generally have pretty high temperature compared to the non-thin. However, during a drought period in 2021, that temperature difference gets much smaller. And most importantly, during the drought period, canopy temperature increase for the non-thinned area was much greater compared to the thinned area, indicating that these trees got super, super hot. And they were not transpiring, they were not evaporatively cooling, because they have much lesser soil water available. And so these trees just got hot and dry and got extremely vulnerable to drought conditions. So the thinning treatment has had several important effects, including increased soil moisture and increased canopy moisture. Then in my final example, I just wanted to share some results from a recent project that my lab group has been working on, where we are monitoring the St. fire impacts right outside of Flagstaff. You probably have all heard that Flagstaff Watershed Protection Project, as part of FORFRI, was thinning the forested areas right outside of Flagstaff, specifically to the north of the edge of town. In summer 2019, of course, some of the thinning equipment ignited a fire in 2019, and we had the same fire burning 2-3 miles from downtown Flagstaff. And so we have been monitoring that. Also, on top of that, since the thinning and since the Museum fire, we had the mega drought that started in late 2019, early 2020. But so basically, we didn't get a lot of precipitation on the fire scar for over 2 years. But then suddenly, monsoon season hit hard last summer. So in July, we had a 100-year rainfall event. A few days later, we had a 200 to 500-year rainfall event that actually hit the exact fire scar, and we got huge floods in Flagstaff. Probably a lot of you saw the YouTube video of a Prius that was flowing down the street in the flood. And so that's what we are monitoring in our lab. So here I'm showing a map of the fire burn area up there at the top, and a thinned area below the fire scar, but right outside of town, that we imaged with our fixed wing UAV, also with a terrestrial LiDAR. How could we look at the impact of this, of all these things? Because we happened to image this exact study area in 2018, so that's before thinning, before the fire, and before the flood. Then all these events happened, so then we went back in 2021, in fall 2021, with the same fixed wing UAV, with the same sensor. So that's post-thinning, post-wildfire, and post-flood. And then we can compare the multispectral images up at the top two panels here. Multispectral image of the same area. So this is pre-thinning, and this is post-thinning. So we can estimate the canopy cover reduction from the thinning. Also, we photogrammetrically generated the 3D point cloud data of the same area corresponding in these bottom two panels. So using this point cloud data, we can, of course, estimate all of the same variables that I've been talking about. And what we find is that the thinning treatment reduced canopy cover from 36% to 8%. It reduced tree density by about half. Also, interestingly, the distribution of the tree height, in particular mean tree height, changed from the thinning. And of course, it reduced the patch size across the area. We also use the structure from motion LiDAR point cloud data to generate a high resolution digital elevation model pre and post flood to look at erosion and geomorphic changes. And so here is the high resolution digital elevation model that we generated. And across that area, what we estimate is that when the flood came, we received about 7,800 cubic meters of sediment that was deposited downstream of the burned area. And at the same time, about 800 or so cubic meters of sediment was eroded from the city. And so using the high resolution EM, that's the kind of estimates. With that, I will just summarize my key conclusions. One is that UAV data provides us with really interesting high resolution data sets that we can use for all different kinds of research applications. Two, the instruments as well as the data sets tend to be expensive over time. This is because you're constantly trying to keep up with the UAV technology and the sensor technology, as well as the software and the workflow that are constantly changing and improving. So keep up with that technology over time. That's what it is. With that, I will stop talking and take any questions.
This was great, by the way. I mean, I really enjoyed it. I have a couple of questions. First of all, if we go at the very beginning of when you have the octocopter, the LiDAR sensor, you said it's a single return. Is there a reason for that, or is that because the equipment cannot carry a multi-return LiDAR sensor?
Very good question. So LiDAR sensors are made in two different ways. One is a single return, one is a multiple return. multiple return data, laser hits the top of the tree, and then keeps on going, and sends you multiple returns. And so throughout that canopy, you get several different elevation points. At the time when this platform was getting custom engineered for my lab, only one type of LiDAR scanner was small enough to be carried by a drone. Typically, if you see a LiDAR scanner, they're pretty big and heavy, and which is why they sit on a tripod. There's also now a mobile LiDAR scanner that you can walk around and carry and image your whole plot, which we are also starting to use. But all of those are big and bulky. And so you're talking about a much larger drone, possibly just or something like that, which is why the multi-return LiDAR scanners are typically operated on a manned aircraft, not on the UAV.
So my second question is, when you, in a different life, I did neural networks and feature extractions and such. What kind of feature extraction methods are you applying?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I don't want you to give it about what are you using in general?
Yeah, so the point cloud data, we delineate individual trees both in an R software. Also, there's an image analysis software called 𝐁𝐵.
Oh,
And it has object extraction methods, algorithms built into it. So we do that. That is if you were to use a multispectral image. It also has a LiDAR analysis module built into it that also extracts.
that's about it for now. Thank you so much.
I had a question on the optimal tree height for shade cover. Did you ever get a number? Height for shade cover?
Yes, we did. Let's see. What is that number? I have to think on it. In terms of height range, we're across that thinned area, we were getting range of values, probably ranging from anywhere between 3 meters to about 25 meters. What we found is that the really, really tall trees, 25-meter trees, don't give us a lot of shade. The really short trees don't give us a lot of shade, but somewhere around 18 to 20 meters is a good height because the really tall trees are what we call the lollipop trees. They're very tall with a very small canopy just at the top because these trees were growing in a very dense environment. And so they built all their biomass just at the top. So post thinning, we were left with lots of tall trees, but very little biomass at the top of it.
So you mentioned that you can assess tree heights. Do you mean the true tree height or the marketable height? And are you able to calculate or estimate the marketable volume we would move?
We are talking about the total tree height. We also, from that, separate just the canopy height so that what's left is just the base to canopy height. We don't estimate marketable height or volume, mostly because I guess we're not in the industry, but we have been assessing basal area and the dBH of individual trees to see how accurate those measurements are. From the UAV LiDAR, we don't get very accurate measurements of those. And from the terrestrial LiDAR, we get very, very accurate measurements of those, of course. What we have also demonstrated is that, or documented, is that structure from motion data gives you below canopy measurements, but the dBH measurements, and therefore the basal area measurements from that SfM point cloud data is not very accurate. Yes.
You had mentioned finding the hyperspectral image.
say briefly?
Yeah, so if you were just using LiDAR data, for example, pinions versus junipers have the exact same height. They have the same canopy diameter. So from a LiDAR data, even if you delineate individual canopies, those two trees you can't really tell just based on height or shape. But if you had a unique hyperspectral signature for those trees, then you combine that and you can say, I know these are trees, they're not shrubs based on height. And based on the spectral signature, I know these are two different species, even though they have the same height.
Thank you, Teki.